As long as 6 years is, did you know indie game development like this isn't uncommon? Just look at these games here. Cave Story, 5 years. Fez took 6. The Witness, 7 years. Owlboy, almost a decade. And Yandere Simulator. These games are really a testament of what indie game developers can do if they're dedicated enough to stick with a project. I mean, ask yourself this. What have you spent the last 5 to 10 years of your life doing? And would you be dedicated enough to spend that large chunk of time on a single project? Competent people who can do this can really polish an idea and create something special. It allows them to Frankenstein their inspirations into their own game, where nostalgia meets modernity and where the unconventional can become a cult hit. I love indie games for this reason, and the past year alone had some really fun indie games that exploded that I genuinely enjoyed. But the indie title that really got my attention last year was a Kickstarter game that had a troubled development. Despite several thousands of positive reviews, it upset quite a few people who helped its creation in the beginning. Its scarce updates and lack of communication made it seem like it was one of many crowdfunded projects that went into production limbo, or just straight up got abandoned. It was a long and rough process, one that the game's director didn't anticipate. But it's finally out, and that game is called Hikikomori. It's a label given to someone who suffers severe social withdrawals. They're people who isolate themselves to the point of never leaving their home, be it months or years. It affects hundreds of thousands of people in Japan alone, and reasons as to why people retreat from society can range from aimlessness in life to more traumatic events and mental health reasons. And the protagonist in Omori is one of them. And the game has us put together the pieces of what caused our main character to become a hikikomori. And it's all packaged up in a neat mix of psychological horror, colorful whimsy, and heartfelt drama. It's a pretty wild ride, and you should check it out if you're a fan of games like Yumaniki or Earthbound. And if you're now thinking, oh, here we go again, another RPG inspired by Earthbound, ooh. I don't blame you. But here's the interesting thing. When Omori was being developed, games like Lisa and Undertale hadn't even come out yet. Hypothetically speaking, if Omori got released in 2015 like it was promised, these 3 games would have come out all within the span of a year. So why wasn't Omori released in 2015? By the looks of things, ignorant ambition, unfortunate circumstances, and a great underestimation of how much work goes into a game. So, let's introduce the game's director. She goes by the name of Omocat. Alongside making a few webcomics, she's best known for the Japanese-influenced apparel that she sells. Omocat, however, isn't known for making games. In fact, this was the first game she's ever done. And considering the main story ended up being 20 hours long, excluding the optional paths and missions, this is a massive undertaking as a first-time project. Ideally, you want to encounter the most basic problems in smaller, less ambitious projects before you tackle something big, in order to gain a decent understanding of the craft and your own abilities. And if you don't, your ignorance will be creating a harmful optimistic projection of what you think you're able to do. Just look at this game made by Adam Butcher, who has worked on Tobias and the Dark Scepters since he was 13 years old. Production began in 2001 and ended in 2014. And it looks like this. Anyway, he has a whole video explaining why it took so long, and I recommend you check it out. Basically, his ambition and ignorance got the better of him, and then suddenly 13 years go by, which results in this end product. This is the result of not starting small and not knowing the basics, which ended up with him encountering the most basic of problems in his passion project and having to redo a lot of work as a result. But let me tell you something, Adam didn't have a Kickstarter. He could easily spend another 13 years on his game if he wanted to and not feel the pressure of disappointment from a bunch of anonymous people. Whereas Omocat had that pressure. $200,000 worth of pressure. 5,910 people backed Omori, and it's not hard to see why. The trailer looks great and a lot was promised. 8+ dungeons, 60+ unique NPCs, a bunch of unnecessary details, and really long gameplay. This is a lot for a first-time developer. Now, to be fair to Omocat, it's not like she just started this Kickstarter by herself. She had 3 other people, 2 on music and 1 programming. And this person, Arkia, is quite experienced in RPG Maker due to her qualifications. And before the Kickstarter launched, the earliest post I could find related to the game was on July 31st of 2013 on Tumblr, a whole year after the Omori comic ended in March 2012. So somewhere between these 2 dates is when Omocat decided to pick up RPG Maker and start working the game out. So, by the looks of things, Omocat has been tinkering around with the idea for quite some time. Of course, she wasn't working full-time on the game during this period, but I'm showing this because it's not like she came out with the campaign out of nowhere. The trailer alone took around a month to make, so there was a bit of planning involved. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. With an initial release date of early 2015, they had less than a year to implement all these ambitious features. But hey, they have mentioned in their risks and challenges section that game development is never smooth, so delays are to be expected. And there were quite a few. Their early 2015 release date turned into May 2015, then it jumped into fall 2016, which eventually turned into between December 2016 and January 2017, then the end of 2019. Then finally, December 25 of 2020. That's 5.5 years after its initial release date. Now, understandably, there were a number of Kickstarter backers who were quite pissed off about these delays, and I bet none of them would have thought that it would take this long, and Omocat probably thought the same thing. We as people, unless we are tracking our own hours, are pretty terrible at estimating and managing our time. People who thought they watched 15 hours of TV per week were actually watching 28, and people who say they worked 60 hours per week were actually working more like 44 hours. And these are activities that we are very familiar with. And even experienced game developers often push back their dates as well. So when you put this into perspective with someone who's never made a game, who wants to make a massive project, the likelihood of getting the date right is awfully low. And sure, Omocat may know what she needs to do, but knowing how to do it is something I'm sure is out of her skill sets. So you need people to help you out. And what initially started off as a team of 4 ended up growing much larger by the release of the game. Because if you want to implement a lot of things into your game within a reasonable time frame, you're going to need a lot of man-hours to do the work. And you also have to take into account the unexpected stuff too. The game engine having to be switched alongside some broken plugins created massive delays. You can read all about it in the January 2017 update. In short, it got really messy. Regardless of the reasons for the delays, backers will unfortunately be less understanding as time goes on. Especially when these delays make some of the stretch goals obsolete, like the 3DS version of Omori that was supposed to come out. And the angry backers can be reported back as early as 2015 in the Kickstarter's comment section. The reason? It was not managed well, and it caused a bunch of confusion. The updates were described as unexciting and unimpressive, as people demanded more updates showing progress. It gave the impression that the Omori team weren't working on the game, which resulted in the general attitude that this game was never going to be released. So when something like a break for staff is mentioned for health reasons, it seemed like a joke. Arkia offers an explanation for the scarcity, and it's understandable. A month's work that gets done may not be visually enticing as an update. So hypothetically speaking, if there was a lot of work done, people won't feel appreciative despite the progress being made because it may not even look like effort. This makes impressive monthly updates fairly difficult. Also, Omocat liked keeping things a secret to surprise people once the game eventually came out. This ended up hurting them, because compared to other completed projects, Omori's update count was quite low by the end of it. While there are various variables to consider, it's easy to see why people got worried during these update droughts from a quick glance. So this unease had people try contacting the team and demanding refunds, and the responses were scarce, if there were any at all. The majority of the comments in the Kickstarter page were complaining about the lack of transparency and communication, so when a problem arose, contacting the team was like talking to a wall. This frustration is understandable since not one of them got a single reply in here. Seriously, there isn't a single comment by Omocat or crew seen in this comment section of the Kickstarter throughout the entirety of its development. The replies in the updates fare a bit better, with about 5 in the span of 6.5 years. Hopefully there's more than this, because as a non-backer, I can't see the comments of exclusive backer posts. So yeah, the project ended up being pretty silent, and somebody even wanted to take legal action because of how shady and secretive it all felt. And while a lot of people's messages were being ignored, Omocat Shop was pretty busy. Between the Kickstarter being funded and the game's release, Omocat had collaborated quite a few times with some recognizable brands. She even had a pop-up shop featuring the latest demo of Omori. It was open for anybody to play, while the people who backed the project didn't receive the demo when it was going on. At least they tried getting the demo out to the backers before the event, but for some reason they couldn't. And when they eventually sent it out months later, quite a number of people for some reason didn't receive it. It might have been in the spam folder. Regardless, this just adds fuel to the fire. I've interviewed a handful of backers about their experiences and asked if they ever tried contacting the Omori team. One backer felt like doing so was pointless since they saw a crowd of people complaining without any answers. And another who actually did send out a refund request, but never got a response. This backer, among others, tried contacting Omocat and crew through other means, but again, no response. And this is Kickstarter's refund policy. It's completely out of their hands. So you had to go to the people manning the project. And this silence became concerning. The belief that this whole thing was a scam became a lot more prevalent. Even one of the backers expressed this to me. They had pretty strong feelings. And I agree. It's awful that refunds weren't issued sooner. Omocat should be totally held accountable with how she and her crew handled this. And people thinking this was a scam? Definitely understandable. But fortunately, as awfully long as it took, the game did end up arriving. Despite the mishandled production and the word scam being thrown around, I'm willing to believe that Omocat had every intention to release this game. I just think that she's grossly inexperienced and unprofessional. She fell victim to the planning fallacy, as her optimism and ignorance created an unrealistic release date. And while it made backers excited, it didn't prepare them for the greatly postponed release and the damage that came with it. And the silence made the frustrations even worse. Regardless, the game eventually did come out. And having played Omori, it's clear a lot of time and care went into this game. If Omori didn't have that ambitious sincerity, you'd get a Mighty No. 9, or even worse, a Yogg Ventures. So if Omocat was more transparent about how she balances her work hours between the game and the shop, instead of leaving her backers in the dark, then this sort of speculation might have been greatly reduced. I'm not saying this will stop it 100%, considering people can be know-it-alls and will complain about anything, but it helps. Of course, games take a long time, but the average person doesn't really know why, and helping the layman understand why might make us more forgiving. For example, Brian Cox, of Blue Omen Operation, said that the art of JRPG-type games are a massive time sink, and there's a lot of effort that goes into a game that people take for granted. From the font, the colors, and the UI, and much more, there's so much going on than the average consumer thinks there is, and a significant amount of time is spent on polishing the game to make everything feel coherent and seamless. This part here is what makes a game feel like it was deceptively simple to make. It's hard work, and the more stuff you put in, the effort and time required to polish becomes exponential. And considering how art-heavy Omori is, alongside the amount of content there is to do, a lot of time and effort was poured into this thing. And despite this quote, I can't see the final version of Omori being done in a year. Maybe if it was the game that they initially showcased, but I think Omocat's passion wanted more than that. Less of an Earthbound clone and more of something that she could call her own. And let me be clear here. Passion alone doesn't absolve her of her ineptitude. A passionate person doesn't automatically mean they're good or competent. Despite good intentions, this was handled awfully. I think it was a poor decision for a project to be this large and ambitious. I think it was a poor decision to launch a Kickstarter despite never making a game before. And I think it was a poor decision to be so inept in your communication with your backers to the point that you ruined the trust of a lot of people who had faith in your brand. She could be an awful person behind the scenes, for all I know. She could have put that money from Omori into her clothing line. Who knows? But before I speculate on Omocat's thought process, I want to share this. 24 days before the Kickstarter ended, Omocat posted this. It is very important to me that this game is made in RPG Maker. Not only am I a fan of RPG Maker games, but I also want to promote this platform that supports and provides the tools for DIY storytelling and game making. For this reason, I am also keeping the game development team as small as possible. It's more work for us, but I believe the end product will be beyond worth it. Having gone through art school, I've always felt that games were viewed as money-making products instead of art, but just because it is commercial doesn't mean that it's not good. In fact, I would argue the exact opposite. As creating games becomes easier in the future, I want to get across the idea that game making is an art medium. I'm creating an art piece called Omori, and my medium is a video game. This game is going to be about my expression, and with the help of the Omori team, it will become realized. I can't wait to show you all the final results of our labor of love. Alongside this statement, she also mentions that Omori started out as a personal project, and it helped her out with a lot of problems during a confusing part of her life. And since this game features themes of bullying and lashing out at the world, something that she's all too familiar with, I'm willing to believe that Omocat's statement from 6 years ago still holds true now. Unfortunately, passion and labor of love don't immediately equate to efficiency or proficiency. Passion can cultivate skill, but passion without skill or experience is just blind enthusiasm, and that has its flaws. So, here comes my speculation of how things went so badly. Omocat, naively, made this project way too ambitious. Too many things to implement, and too much work. But this is Omocat's passion project. This is close to her heart, and this will be the best thing it can be, no matter what. And she wanted to promote a DIY way of storytelling because this was her art. But she bit off more than she could chew, and the expected release date had to be delayed numerous times. For the sake of her health, she had to hire help. To hire these new employees, this required extra income, and $200,000 is only so much runway for more than a 4-person team. Which technically wasn't $200,000 because Kickstarter takes a cut alongside tax. So, when that money ran out, Omocat had to set aside some time for the shop, which probably grew more busy and required more of her attention as it grew too. And as the years went by and Omocat had to juggle two things at once, her more public business made it look like she just ditched Omori as the team worked silently in the background. But unfortunately, the infrequent updates felt like the backers were being cheated, especially since they were the ones who helped back Omocat's project, way before she started getting the attention of big names. So while the backlash was happening and steadily growing as the years go by, she left her backers in the dark since the best she could do was bury herself in the game. Now, I don't want to discount the folks who were happy throughout the game's development, because there were people still excited and understanding throughout all of it. But you shouldn't ignore the people genuinely frustrated by this experience. Best case scenario, this is just a vocal minority in a survivor's bias situation. But the fact that the first refund period was around September of 2019, which was 5 years later after the Kickstarter got funded, probably created a lot of resentful people during that time frame. Transparency is key, and when the frustrated occupy your silence, your project ain't looking too good. And word spreads fast, especially when other campaigns manage to respond to their backers and you don't. Of course, hindsight is 2020, and production began around when Kickstarter crowdfunding was relatively new, and people didn't know running a campaign was essentially a full-time job. And I'm sure a lot of things would have been done differently had she known better and started smaller. As busy as she was, maybe setting some time to respond to some backers would have helped quell the commotion. If she knew her business was going to be successful after graduating college, maybe the Kickstarter never would have happened in the first place. And while the indie game scene does showcase that anyone can make a game nowadays, spending the time to hone your skills helps, especially when other people's money is involved. When you take a look at a Kickstarter game whose team is led by experienced professionals as opposed to a recent college graduate, there is a clear difference. In 2 to 3 years, Team Cherry developed Hollow Knight, a lengthy game that's filled to the brim with quality. And it's not like people unfamiliar with game development can't have the process go well. Having talked to Yugo Limbo of Limbo Lane, they've mentioned developing Smile for Me went surprisingly smoothly. This is a fantastic achievement since it was Limbo's first game, and it's probably thanks to its small scope, the small team, and an organized work ethic. Put these all together, and 1 year later, Smile for Me was released, and at about 4 hours long, the simple gameplay with a very charming aesthetic shows off the bare minimum of what the team is capable of. I greatly enjoyed my time with it, and I wanted a lot more. While obviously not perfect, this is a great stepping stone, and I'm eager to see how they can improve themselves even further with their games. And ideally, as creatives, we must learn from our mistakes as fast as we can so we can improve upon our craft. We learn by doing and improving on our mistakes with every iteration, and it's best to make these mistakes on projects that aren't so near and dear to our hearts, especially when there's a lot of people's money on the line. And I've personally felt that during my time on this channel. Just look at my Y2K review. I was figuring out my style, and it had a lot of issues. And I'd like to think I've incrementally improved with every video I've made in some sort of way since then. And if given the opportunity to redo that video, I'd probably do a better job. But that video wasn't near and dear to me though. But for Omocat, Omori was special. Whatever comes out better be damn great considering this was her baby. No room for error, no room for mistakes. This was her passion project, and she broke the trust of several people in the process. There is a colossal personal standard. So, how's the game? I like it a lot.
Really? Yes.
Well, parts of it. Some other parts feel kinda sluggish to the point where it greatly affects the game as a whole, and I think it coincides with the goals stated in the Kickstarter. Earlier I mentioned Omocat's goal for 8 dungeons and really long gameplay, which was later reinforced in a 2017 update. It was something that they were eager to share. While an admirable selling point cause it seems like you're getting more bang for your buck, this is not something you should necessarily be aspiring for. Don't mistake length for depth, since padding out the runtime isn't necessary for a good game. From a developer perspective though, I'd understand why you'd want to bloat your game. It's been in development for over half a decade. There's a lot of frustrated fans out there that want this thing to be worth their time. So, to showcase that there's a lot of content is a great way to have the rest of your backers remain excited. And one of the most painful things as a developer is cutting out content, even though it's for the sake of the overall product. Imagine spending a tremendous amount of time and effort into an aspect of a game that no one is ever going to see, because for some reason, it just didn't work out. That's essentially what happened with Patch Quest. The developer essentially scrapped a lot of his 3 years worth of effort because his game fundamentally didn't work at its core. So no matter what he did, the shoddy foundation can't be improved upon no matter how much stuff you put on it. So he had to start from the ground up. Or check out Owlboy. Nearly a decade, remember? And the developers just scrapped years of hard work that just never appeared in the game whatsoever. From environments, to cutscenes, to boss fights, all of it had to be scrapped in order for the game to remain focused. But now, imagine running a Kickstarter showing a bunch of stuff, only to strip it away and have your backers feel cheated that they missed out on a feature. Nonetheless, nothing is sacred and forcing in an idea is not worth harming the overall product. I'm not sure if there's a term for this. The only thing that springs to mind is a class in film school where my teacher said, if necessary, you need to kill your baby. So we'll stick with that. Kill your baby if it's necessary. So while these goals are, on the surface level, appealing, it's not something you should strive for. And while there is a lot of main content in Omori, a substantial amount of it can either be cut out or replaced with something better. Ideally with something that should have aided its strongest asset, its story. And the story's quality is a lot stronger in one half of the game because of how it's structured. Omori is split into 2 sections, this world of escapism called Headspace, and reality. Something quite traumatizing happened to our main character, and its severity caused him to create this idealized world to prevent him leaving his house for over 4 years. So we, as the player, get to see idealized versions of his friends, compared to what they actually are in the real world. And as fun as these characters are, The reality is far more interesting than anything in Headspace. The real-world sections have a nice mix of gameplay gimmicks, exploration, levity, and drama, and it's all wrapped up with really great pacing. Whereas Headspace doesn't feel tight most of the time, and its quirk and charm can only take me so far. While initially interesting the first time you dive in there, the majority of it feels quite underwhelming. Opportunities to further flesh out these Headspace characters are missing, and they are instead replaced with events and characters that I don't really care for. Which is bothersome because there are moments where aspects of reality start disturbing Headspace, and that's when I got invested. But everything that isn't that, like the castle or the casino or that whale level, the game doesn't feel narratively substantial enough to be worth my time. I know that Space Boyfriend and Slime Girls are referencing the people who helped compose the music, but did their bosses really add anything emotionally to the game? As nice as this gesture was, and as painful as it was dropping other features, you had to drop this one too and replace it with something else. You had to kill this baby. I'd personally rather have these events have some sort of impact on our characters, as opposed to the shallow entertainment we got. And the result of this was me just wanting to rush through these parts of the game so I can get into the real world because the dynamic of the characters are much more interesting there. Hero was already lovable, but his loss makes him a lot more compelling. Kel is a great best friend character, and Aubrey is a dyed-hair punk with interesting motivations and a likable character arc.
You got hella cash.
While not groundbreaking, these characters ended up being my favorite aspect of the game. And the real world would have been even better if Headspace provided more opportunities for us to explore the protagonist's perspective of how he perceives his friends. It'd be great to have these characters develop and question themselves or Omori when reality seeps in, because I want plot that fleshes out our characters. I like the relationship between Headspace and reality, and the foundation to do this is there. I just wanted the game to take it an extra step further and do it more consistently. Remember what I said in my Beyond Two Souls video. We should be learning new things about our characters with every major event that they experience. But these levels most of the time serve no purpose beyond surface level amusement, which isn't inherently bad, but these events we have to go through greatly overstay their welcome. It felt like filler in order to satisfy the long gameplay goal, but all it did was ruin the pacing. And I totally understand that this world is supposed to be an escapist fantasy, so development might have never been on the table. It's supposed to be a distraction, and it's supposed to be fun, right? It just ended up being ironic that I found the fun ideal fantasy incredibly dull. If they remained the same throughout the Hikikomori route, that's fine, it's achieving its purpose. I just think there's a lot of wasted potential, especially when we eventually step out into the real world. This could have easily been a catalyst for some development for the Headspace characters, because Omori is now struggling to maintain his made-up versions of his idealized friends. What if Aubrey's current personality started corrupting Headspace Aubrey? Or have the bosses represent the reality of our party members, and us beating them is us suppressing reality? We at least get stuff like Basil slowly being erased out of Headspace and Marie being an enigma, which is cool. I like it a lot, for the most part, but moments like these are too far in between. The intrigue I got from the download window mini-boss was not existent up until the end of Headspace. And while the first boss is fine in order to establish the status quo, the charm of the other bosses wasn't strong enough to maintain my narrative investment in Headspace. And this huge drought in interest is incredibly disheartening, as it results in the game's wasted potential and a pacing that's quite monotonous. It's quirky for the sake of being quirky, and while not as bad as Y2K, it suffers from the same problem. It makes for great side content, not so much when it's the main game. But we got what we got, and these sections would have been better if the battle system was put to better use. I really wanted to dig my teeth into the combat, because I like it a lot. The emotion system is a lot of fun, and I'll give this game extra props because grinding is not necessary. A game that has grinding as an option as opposed to a necessity is one that I love. And I'll give Omori even more props for having a boss like Sweetheart. It's a rough boss battle if you're not paying attention and using everything in your arsenal, and it was by far the biggest highlight in the game in terms of combat. And unfortunately, the gameplay never reaches this great intersection of player skill and difficulty ever again. While I'm indifferent about the mobs, almost every boss after Sweetheart feels like a letdown in terms of mechanics. For whatever reason, they don't take advantage of the emotion mechanic like Sweetheart did. They don't feel as interesting in comparison to her since they don't test the limits of the mechanics as much as she did. And while the Hikikomori route pushes the mechanics a lot more, I don't want to pursue that route because it treads on the half of the game that I don't care about. And I'd rather not play a huge chunk of the game just to get to the good part. Like literally, if it wasn't for the real world and that great ending, I would have been fairly disappointed. If the pacing was tight, the plot jam-packed, and the main story combat a lot more involved, I would be in love with this game, 100%. And I'm deliberately hiding aspects of this game because I wanted to avoid the good stuff if ever you decided to check out this game. Because so far, I think there is a fantastic game that's buried beneath 6 feet of monotony. But your mileage may vary. If the aesthetic and quirk is enough to carry you through Headspace, that's cool, but it wasn't for me. Hence my disappointment. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, there is a lot to love. The art direction is neat, the real-world characters are super charming, and the soundtrack is full of bangers and emotionally moving scores. Even some of the shallow, quirky stuff ended up winning me over. Like here, let me show you some highlights of me enjoying the game.
I'm begging you, just ask her to give it back. She won't listen to me. Oh, is Aubrey a bitch to Basil? What's going on over there? Oh, we got the delinquent kids. Oh, Aubrey's a bitch. Gah! What the? Is that a knife? Oh, we're working with real world rules. I mean, to be fair, you have a knife with nails in it. Oh, is Aubrey gonna die? Really? You really want to bring Marie into this? Who cares about what Marie thinks? Marie's... Ah! I wasn't expecting... Oh. Well, why not? Oh, I'm gonna die. Oh, shit. Holy. Oh! Whoa! Now remember, you have to have 3 pizzas to deliver. Pizza. When you're done, just bike your way back to the shop. I'm counting on you. Please take this pizza to... Meow stares at you. She tilts her head out of curiosity. Do you want to cut open? Well. Meow stares at you. Her eyes widen. She wants to go now. Do you want to cut open? Meow stares at you. She struggles to break free. Do you want to cut it open? She stares at you. Her eyes are filled with desperation. Do you want to cut her open? She tries to scream, but there's no sound. Do you want to cut open? Meow stares at you. She doesn't know what's happening. Do you want to cut open? Meow. Holy shit! Oh shit! I'm normal colored. Interesting. I'm assuming. So again, I'm assuming Omori and Salad are 2 different people or something. Ah! Yo! This is hype. Yo! So, you do understand my conflict, right? I want to love this game. I really do, because the highs can be pretty high, but the valleys in between these peaks are vast. And despite the level of polish in areas like the music, the aesthetic, and some story beats, a narrative-driven game whose pacing and plot becomes mind-numbingly boring at points severely dampens the overall product.
But isn't the game awful because of, you know?
Oh, right. Yeah, let's talk about it. To quickly catch up on the uninformed, a large part of the game revolves around Marie's death, and her sudden death caused the kids to fracture and go their separate ways, similar to Anohana. And the story does a pretty good job in making us care about the person they've lost, and they do this by making us gradually get to know Marie, as each breadcrumb of information we get makes us care about her more, while in turn making it easier to empathize with our main characters. It's done really well, and the game pulled on my heartstrings more than I thought it would. Specifically the recital leitmotif and its significance to Marie and Sunny, That really got me, and I applaud the game for it. Which then leads us to finding out how she actually died. It turns out Sunny, the actual protagonist, was the one who killed Marie by pushing her down the stairs. This was an accident, and ridden with guilt, Sunny, alongside Basil, frames the manslaughter as a suicide. I thought it was a pretty great twist, but upon further reflection, in order for this to be plausible, you had to accept a couple of things. 1. The plan. Are you willing to believe that these kids had the capacity to think of such a morbid cover-up? And when they did, they were willing to go through with it. Can kids even make a noose? Well, turns out they can. Real-life kids of that age planned out more complicated things. So this doesn't feel like much of a stretch for these guys in terms of planning. But what about in terms of character? After all, this might feel like tonal whiplash for flower boy Basil and timid Sunny to do, but I'm personally fine with it due to its extreme circumstances. Stress and anxiety causes us to act uncharacteristically, so I'm willing to believe that these nice kids were willing to do something pretty morbid to avoid repercussions. But could they get away with it? Let's jump to 2. Cleaning the crime scene. During Marie's death, she falls onto Sunny's broken violin. Judging by the Truth photo album, there doesn't seem to be much blood, so a couple of kids cleaning some small bloodstains here and there would be believable enough. They could have spent the entire day setting everything up too. Considering the amount of time spent planning all this out is never mentioned, but we get to retrieve said broken violin later in the game, alongside some sheet music. It's described to be wrinkled with blood. How much blood? And did the parents ever see the bloodstains and question it? Or even question about the violin and how it broke in the first place? If there was blood on the sheet music, there must have been some sort of blood on her dress. How do you get blood on your dress if you hanged yourself? Kinda suspicious, don't you think? 3. The autopsy. Assuming this takes place in America, nearly all states require an autopsy when a person dies. So if one was ever performed on Marie, something like a broken spine will cause some suspicion. But looking further into this, apparently only one state is required for an autopsy during a person's suicide, and that's Florida, whereas 6 other states have a discretion. So unless Sunny was Florida man, there's a possibility that Sunny and Basil could get away with it. What about the parents though? Couldn't they request for one? Of course, and this puts a foil in Sunny's and Basil's plan, but they could also be religious, and their faith may discourage them for a loved one to undergo an autopsy. They live close to a church after all, one that Marie's buried behind. But it turns out not all religions completely disallow an autopsy. Most Christian denominations are okay with it, with Jehovah's Witnesses being the exception. And they don't use the symbol of the cross, so this can't be one of their churches. So what am I trying to say here? Nothing concrete, obviously, since we are in super vague territory. This has its problems, but further fleshing out the parents might have detracted from the story's focus, so you had to pick one. But what about the police though? A suicide is considered a crime scene, so the police will have to be involved if Marie's death was deemed odd. And I'm pretty sure they could easily piece together that the bruises and the blunt force trauma on her body don't line up with a suicide. In all honesty, this is where it starts falling apart for me, since I feel like I'm grasping at straws for an explanation. Maybe the police and parents made a deal to not let anybody else know, so they kept it under wraps. There's a scene where someone is cutting down a tree, probably Sunny's dad, and he says this, so maybe the parents know the truth. And maybe that's why he's out of the picture in the present day, since he's ashamed of Sunny's actions. At least that's how Sunny interprets his father leaving. Or maybe the police are just incompetent. It's apparently not uncommon, but we're really pushing it. Number 4. Why was Basil there? There could be a number of believable reasons. I just think it's kind of funny how he's conveniently there at the scene of the crime. Anyway, if you put all these things together, while it's not impossible for something like this to happen, it's just super improbable. Personally, it doesn't completely ruin the story for me. The story is much more about how these characters have dealt with their grief, and it's not so much about solving a murder mystery and how these kids got away with it. And with what they've decided to focus on, I think it's done pretty well, and the characters' lovable dynamic more than makes up for the shaky setup that it's built upon. At least it is for me, but the people who think this is too contrived is not unfounded, and it could easily ruin the story for you. It just depends whether or not you're willing to accept the setup. There's probably a better setup for the story about overcoming years of guilt, self-forgiveness, and accepting the truth, but it is what it is. So, overall thoughts? regardless of the amount of love and effort put into something, I'm gonna be judging it on what was delivered. And I think it's good. Not amazing, but good. Pretty good even, since there is a lot to adore. And Omocat and her team should be proud of what they've made, because this is their first game. Omocat tackled something that she was super unfamiliar with, and she suffered the consequences. Her only experience with storytelling was with short webcomics, and jumping to something as big as a 20-hour-long game with a bunch of side content is a huge leap. And since she had no prior experience in game making, of course there were going to be issues. It got pretty messy because of an optimistic release date, overambition, and poor communication. And when compared to other Kickstarters, it could have been handled a lot better. Will Omocat make more games? Who knows? The goal was to make Omori a game, not to become a video game developer. And the only reason why Omori is a game to begin with was because she thought this was the best way to present Omori's story. It was her passion project, which also led to the mishandling of people's money and trust. And as much as I advocate staying offline and getting deep work done, ignoring complaints entirely, probably not the greatest thing to do. Learn how to communicate with your audience better, or your silence will come off as maliciousness. The shop service seems to be better though. Having bought one of Omocat's shirts, I thankfully got a quick response when an issue arose, so at least things are better in that department. Anyway, I hope for the best for Omocat. I genuinely do. Fingers crossed she handles things a bit better next time. Especially when a lot of people's money is on the line.